A 12-year-old girl is bleeding out on a gurney, and nobody in the room knows it yet. Nobody except the woman standing at the edge of the trauma bay, a quiet nurse that her co-workers barely remember to greet. She can tell by the way the child is holding her breath. That specific stillness. She's seen it before, on a different kind of battlefield. The doctor in charge has already made his decision. Quarantine the East Wing. Prioritize the trauma cases. Wait for orders from the state. It sounds reasonable. It sounds professional. It will also get everyone inside that wing killed within hours and take half the hospital with them. She knows this. She has the training, the field experience, and the memory to know this with absolute certainty. He doesn't listen. He tells her to go back to her station and stay within her scope of practice. So she does something that requires more courage than any argument. She goes back to her station, picks up the phone, and calls a number she has memorized for 8 years and never once used. Because what nobody in that hospital knows, not the doctors, not the administrators, not the man who is quietly dying in the East Wing on purpose, is that this unremarkable overnight nurse was once listed as killed in action in a military report that had to be corrected 6 months later when she walked out of a jungle in the Congo, carrying 2 surviving soldiers and a field surgery she'd performed on herself with a folding knife. By morning, a federal epidemiologist will be standing in that hospital asking one question: who designed this containment protocol? And the entire room will go silent because the answer is standing at the nurse's station, charting, like nothing happened. The question is, what exactly did she contain? The cold came in January the way it always did in Billings, not as an event, but as a condition. It settled over the rimrocks and descended into the valley floor without ceremony, pressing against the windows of Rimrock Valley Medical Center with a patience that felt almost personal. The Yellowstone River ran steel gray to the east. The streets were empty by 9 in the evening. The city had folded into itself, the way it always did when winter finally stopped pretending. Dina Swiftwind pulled her '09 Silverado into the employee lot at 10:47 p.m. and sat for a moment before turning off the engine. The rosary hanging from the rearview mirror swayed once and went still. She did not look at it. She had stopped looking at it years ago, which was different from having stopped believing in it. She was 38, Crow Nation. She wore her hair pulled back so tightly, it seemed to have made a decision about itself. Her face held the particular composure of someone who had learned to keep their interior weather completely separate from their exterior weather, the way certain landscapes hold their most dramatic features hidden from the road. She clocked in at 10:58. She brewed a pot of coffee because the one on the counter had turned to something closer to silt. She checked the supply closet in Corridor B. She had noticed 3 days ago that the sterile gauze packs were running low, had filed the request herself without telling anyone, and confirmed now that the new shipment had arrived and been stacked incorrectly. She restacked it. It took 4 minutes. She told no one. This was how Dina existed inside Rimrock Valley Medical Center, not invisibly exactly. More the way a load-bearing wall exists inside a house, essential, unremarked, and only noticed in its catastrophic absence. The other nurses had taken to calling her the Shadow, which they delivered without cruelty, in the offhanded way that people name things they've decided aren't worth understanding. She absorbed the nickname the way she absorbed most things, completely, without reaction, and without forgetting. Dr. Prentice Caldwell arrived at 11:15 for what should have been a brief check-in before handing the overnight to the resident on call. He was 51, fourth-generation Montanan, possessed of the specific confidence that accumulates in men who have never once had their competence seriously questioned in a room that mattered. He was not a bad doctor. This was the important thing to understand about him, the thing that made him genuinely dangerous rather than merely inconvenient. He was a good doctor who had never developed the habit of listening to people he had already categorized. He passed Dina at the nurse's station without looking at her. She handed him a patient update on bed 7, a post-surgical adult male presenting with elevated fever since the previous shift. She mentioned concisely that the fever pattern was inconsistent with standard post-op presentation and that she wanted to flag it for review. He took the chart. He read the fever numbers. He said, "Probably just a slow drain on the JP. I'll have the resident check it in the morning," and handed it back without making eye contact, already turning toward the attending room. Dina wrote her observation in the chart. She noted the time, the temperature, the pattern, and the fact that she had raised the concern. She did not raise it again that evening. The patient's drain was checked in the morning and found to be functioning correctly, and the fever was subsequently identified as the early presentation of a secondary infection that required IV antibiotics for 11 days. Dr. Caldwell's incident report would later describe the eventual diagnosis as having been caught during routine overnight monitoring. She read that report on her lunch break in her truck. She folded it. She did not mention it to anyone. These were the textures of her ordinary life, a life she had built deliberately out of smallness. The way you build a shelter in the field out of whatever is available, not because you cannot imagine something grander, but because shelter is what the moment requires. A report that was quietly corrected 6 months later, when she emerged from a stretch of dense forest outside Bukavu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, escorting 2 surviving members of her unit and carrying beneath her field dressing a 4-inch incision she had made in herself with a folding knife and a headlamp to evacuate a tension pneumothorax at 2 in the morning, while the jungle pressed in around her and the radio stayed silent. She had come home to Montana not as a hero. Heroes required an audience willing to pay attention. She had come home as a woman who had looked at the outermost edges of what human beings were capable of inflicting on one another and decided, with the kind of clarity that only arrives after everything else has burned away, that she wanted to spend whatever time remained to her putting people back together. The army had taught her to survive anything. It had not taught her how to make Dr. Caldwell look at her when she was speaking. The storm system arrived on a Tuesday and dropped 22 inches in 36 hours. The interstate became a catalogue of jackknifed semis. The Rimrocks disappeared behind a wall of white. Rimrock Valley Medical Center shifted to emergency protocols. No staff rotations, no external transfers, administrative skeleton crew, all available clinical personnel on extended shift. Dina had been awake for 19 hours when the ambulances arrived. The school bus had been carrying 17 children from the Crow Agency to a regional academic competition in Billings. It had hit a patch of black ice on Highway 87, overcorrected, and rolled into a gulch at the road's edge. 11 children were injured, 4 critically. They came in 2 ambulances and the bed of a rancher's pickup truck, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of hay and engine oil, and the trauma bay became immediately, precisely chaotic, the contained, purposeful chaos of a medical team activating everything they had trained for. Dina moved to triage. She worked without speaking more than necessary. She assessed, she prioritized, she flagged, she moved, and then she stopped. At bed 4, a girl, maybe 12, with a laceration across her forehead that had already been dressed by the paramedics and was therefore drawing less attention than it deserved. The girl was conscious. She was cooperative. She answered questions in a small, careful voice. She was, by every visible measure, stable, but she was holding her breath, not all of it, just enough, in a specific way, shallow, controlled, the ribcage making a decision to minimize expansion. Dina had seen this before. She had done it herself once, in a field in eastern Congo, when breathing too deeply meant the pain would register in a way she could not afford. The girl had internal bleeding, and she was 12 years old and trained herself, in the way children sometimes are, to perform fine. Dina flagged it. She flagged it twice. She flagged it to the resident, who was managing 3 other cases, and said he'd get to it. She put a notation in the tablet, and then she went to find Dr. Caldwell, who was managing the trauma bay from its center like a man who understood that visibility was its own form of authority. She told him, standing beside him, in a voice calibrated to carry no drama, "Bed 4, the girl with the forehead lack. I think she's splinting. I want a fast exam." He looked at the board. He looked at the girl in bed 4, who was sitting up slightly and answering the nurse's questions cooperatively. "She's been assessed," he said. "We've got 3 criticals ahead of her." "I know," Dina said. "I'm telling you she's going to be a 4th. He turned back to the board. "We'll get to her in the rotation." Dina stood still for one moment. The monitors beeped around her. Somewhere across the bay, a child was crying in the honest, unself-conscious way of someone who didn't yet know you were supposed to hide it. Then she turned and walked to the supply cabinet and retrieved the fast ultrasound unit herself. She performed the scan in 90 seconds. The image was unambiguous. She showed it to the resident, who went immediately pale and called for the surgical attending. Sadie Plainfeather went into emergency surgery 41 minutes before she would have coded. The surgical notes would later indicate she had been 40 minutes from irreversible hemorrhagic shock. She survived. Dana charted the scan, noted the time, logged the intervention, and returned to triage. The East Wing had gone quiet in a way that was not the quiet of sleep. She looked at the corridor. She looked at the quarantine order that had just appeared on the board. She looked at what she knew about Rimrock Valley's ventilation system, which she had studied during a maintenance emergency 4 months ago because she had needed to understand why a patient's room was consistently colder than the thermostat suggested. She did the calculation. And for the first time since she had come home to Montana, Dina Swiftwind felt the particular cold clarity of a situation that had moved beyond the boundaries of authority and into the territory of simple necessity. Garrett Foss had been admitted 2 days ago. Dana remembered him because she had been the one to run his intake vitals on the night he arrived. Cash payment, vague history, respiratory distress, listed as chief complaint in handwriting so generic it could have belonged to anyone. He was 60, heavy-set, with eyes that tracked the room the way eyes do when someone is used to being watched and has grown tired of pretending otherwise. He had answered her questions politely and briefly, and then looked at the ceiling with the concentrated intentness of a man praying or calculating. She had noted at intake that his symptom presentation was slightly inconsistent with simple respiratory distress. The pattern of onset, the specific quality of the breathing irregularity, the low-grade fever that had been present even then. She had written it in the chart. She had mentioned it to the night attending, a resident named Wills, who was thorough and genuinely attentive, and had nonetheless attributed it to likely viral bronchitis and admitted him for observation. Garrett Foss was now unresponsive. A nurse who had entered to check his vitals was sitting in the corridor outside his room, pale and confused, with a sudden onset headache and nausea that had appeared within 20 minutes of exposure. A second nurse, who had gone to assist the first, was reporting the same symptoms. Caldwell's quarantine protocol sealed the East Wing and redirected all resources to the trauma cases. On paper, it was defensible. In practice, it created a sealed environment with compromised containment around a pathogen whose transmission vector nobody had yet identified, connected to the rest of the hospital by a ventilation system that nobody in this building except Dina had looked at carefully enough to understand. She went to him. She found him at the central board and stood beside him in a way that communicated without aggression that she was not going to be redirected by movement or posture. "The quarantine order seals the East Wing," she said. "But the HVAC crossover between East Wing Corridor B and the Pediatric Recovery Ward runs through the return plenum above the second-floor ceiling. It's a shared system. The seal doesn't address it." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man recalibrating his tolerance. "Where are you getting your HVAC information?" "The maintenance schematic," she said. "I reviewed it in September during the temperature complaint on room 214. "And your infectious disease assessment?" She held his gaze. "I'd like to show you the ventilation layout and the symptom progression. I think we're looking at a bacterial aerosolization event, not viral. The quarantine protocol assumes viral transmission dynamics. If I'm right, it accelerates spread rather than containing it." Around them, the trauma bay continued its controlled urgency. Monitors, voices, the specific percussion of a medical team moving at capacity. "That's an epidemiologist's assessment," Caldwell said. "You're a floor nurse. I know what I'm looking at." He turned back to the board. "Return to your station. Focus on what's in front of you. We'll have the health department on the line within the hour." There were 6 people within earshot. She could feel the texture of the silence they produced, the kind of silence that isn't absence of sound, but presence of attention, the held breath of people who know something uncomfortable is happening and have decided watching it is safer than participating. "Okay," she said. She walked back to the nurse's station. She sat down. She picked up the phone and she dialed a number from memory, 11 digits, a Washington, D.C. prefix, memorized 8 years ago and never once used. It rang 4 times. A man answered with his last name only, the way certain people answer phones when they know the call could be anything. "It's Swiftwind," she said. "I need a CDC contact in the next 20 minutes. I have a potential bacterial aerosolization event at a regional hospital in Billings, Montana, with a contained exposure and a compromised quarantine protocol. I need someone who can call down the chain faster than the state health department can answer their phone in a blizzard." A pause. Then, "Give me 15. She hung up. She looked at the clock. She had 14 minutes to do everything else. What followed was not heroic in any cinematic sense. It was the application of training to circumstance, the thing she had spent 9 years learning to do in environments where the gap between a correct decision and a catastrophic one was measured in minutes rather than meetings. She operated not against Caldwell, but around him, the way water moves around stone. not because it is weaker, but because it is indifferent to the stone's opinion of its direction. She called Tomás Berruecos in facilities maintenance. He was 53, soft-spoken, deeply competent, and possessed of the kind of loyalty that is not given easily or forgotten quickly. She had earned it 4 months ago by doing nothing more than sitting with his father in room 12 for 6 hours during a terminal diagnosis, because the chaplain was unavailable and the family was still an hour away, and the old man had looked at the ceiling with an expression that said he did not want to be alone with whatever was up there. Dina had stayed. She had not said much. She had not needed to. "Tomás," she said, "I need you to treat this as a heating malfunction. Corridor B, East Wing, 2nd floor return plenum. I need the crossover damper manually set to isolation position. I'll explain everything later. Do you trust me?" A pause of approximately 2 seconds. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," he said. She requisitioned isolation materials across 4 separate departmental orders: PPE from surgical supply, portable barrier curtains from the equipment pool, negative pressure fans from the respiratory therapy unit, biohazard disposal materials from the lab. Each order small enough, each from a different source, that none of them individually triggered administrative review. She had them staged at the East Wing entrance in 11 minutes. She briefed the 2 nurses inside the corridor on revised protocol, explaining the changes with the compressed, unambiguous clarity of someone who had given instructions in much louder environments and knew exactly how much information a person could hold in a crisis. She did not tell them where the protocol came from. They did not ask. There is a quality of certainty that, when genuine, communicates itself without credentials. Tomás sealed the plenum damper at 12 minutes and 40 seconds. At 14 minutes her phone rang. She answered it. A woman's voice, precise and unhurried. "This is Dr. Constance Mater, CDC Emergency Response. I've been briefed. Talk to me." Dina talked. She was accurate, sequenced, and concise. She gave symptom onset times, exposure durations, the specific character of the presentation, the rapid neurotoxic component, the aerosolization pattern, the field comparison she was drawing on from a 2013 incident in the Eastern DRC that she referenced without explaining how she knew it. There was a brief silence on the line. "I'm going to need to be on the ground," Meta said. "There's one runway still open at Billings Logan," Dina said. "It may not be for long." She hung up. She looked at the East Wing corridor. The barrier was holding. The fans were running. Tomás was sealing the last edge of the curtain with the focused, unhurried competence of a man who did excellent work and never required an audience for it. The 2 nurses inside had stabilized Garrett Foss. Not recovered, but stabilized, his vitals no longer in freefall, the neurotoxic progression slowed by the intervention Dina had specified. She returned to the trauma bay. She checked on the children from the bus crash. Sadie Plainfeather was in surgery. 3 others were stable and improving. 1 was still critical but holding. At the nurses' station, she opened a chart and began to type. She documented everything: the ventilation assessment, the requisitions, the call, the protocol adjustments. She logged the times. She recorded the names. She noted, with the flat, factual clarity that had become her permanent register, that she had deviated from the authorized quarantine protocol and the reasons why. She did not know yet what was in the East Wing. She knew only what she'd always known, that a protocol built on the wrong diagnosis was worse than no protocol at all, and that the cost of silence was borne by people who had no idea a decision had been made about them. The storm hammered the windows. The rimrocks behind the hospital were invisible in the dark, lost in white. They did not require visibility to remain where they were. Dr. Constance Mater arrived at 3 in the morning on what turned out to be the last flight into Billings Logan International before the airport closed. She came through the emergency entrance of Rimrock Valley Medical Center in a dark coat with snow still on the shoulders, rolling a case of field equipment that she moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to arriving in places that were not expecting her. She was 55, South Asian, with close-cropped grey at her temples, and the particular calm of someone who had spent 3 decades looking at situations that other people needed to look away from. She reviewed the East Wing containment protocol in 18 minutes. She walked the corridor. She reviewed the ventilation modification. She spoke briefly with the 2 nurses who had been working inside the containment zone. She reviewed Garrett Foss's chart, admission history, symptom progression, the initial attending notes, and the flagged observations that had been entered at intake by a nurse whose name she had not yet connected to any face. Then she looked at the protocol again. Specifically, she looked at 4 distinct interventions: the manual damper isolation, The orientation of the negative pressure fans relative to the barrier curtains, the sequencing of the PPE removal procedure that had been communicated to the nurses inside, and the specific pharmaceutical intervention that had been recommended for slowing the neurotoxic progression. Standard CDC emergency containment did not include these adaptations. They had been developed, Meta knew, by Army Medical Command for field deployment in low-resource environments, tested in conditions where you could not wait for a supply chain or a clean facility or a decision from above. She had seen them once before, in a classified after-action report from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 2013. The report had described, among other things, a solo field operator who had managed the partial containment of a biological exposure event in a village outside Bukavu with no equipment beyond what she had carried into the field. The report had praised the outcome and declined to speculate on how the operator had known what she knew. Meta turned to the room. Caldwell, 2 residents, the charge nurse, a hospital administrator named Curtis Beale, who had arrived, as administrators sometimes do, at the precise moment when his presence would be least useful. "I want to understand the containment protocol," she said, "specifically the ventilation modification and the negative pressure configuration. Who designed this?" Caldwell began to speak. He described the quarantine decision, the resource reallocation, the coordination of clinical staff under emergency conditions. He used the word "we" with the smooth frequency of a man who had long understood that institutional outcomes were best described in the plural. Meta let him finish. Then she said with the gentleness of someone who has no need for confrontation because she already knows the answer, "I'm asking specifically about the damper modification and the pharmaceutical sequencing. These are adaptations. They didn't come from our standard protocol. Who made them?" The room shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. No one moved, no voice was raised. It was the subtle internal reorientation of people who have simultaneously realized that the question being asked is not the question they had prepared to answer. Caldwell did not respond immediately. Someone looked toward the nurses' station. Dina Swiftwind was at the station, charting. She had been there in one form or another for the past 4 hours. She was finishing a note on a post-surgical patient in room 7. She did not look up, but she heard the silence. It had a specific quality, the acoustic signature of a room full of people looking in your direction, and she had lived inside enough silences to read them accurately. She looked up. She met Meta's eyes across the distance. Neither of them spoke. There was, between them, the brief recognition of 2 people who have operated in the same category of experience and know it on sight. "The ventilation assessment was mine," Dana said. "And the protocol modifications." Meta held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, in the way that carries more information than most paragraphs. What happened in the hours that followed was not the kind of resolution that announces itself. Meta conducted her review methodically. She confirmed Dina's pathogen identification, a rare bacterial strain that she would later describe, in her report, as exhibiting characteristics consistent with a controlled biological agent rather than a naturally occurring outbreak. She documented the containment success. She documented the timeline. She documented the ventilation modification, the pharmaceutical intervention, and the outcome. And then she reviewed Garrett Foss's admission file with the specific attention of someone who has been trained to look not at what is present, but at what should be present and isn't. The gaps in his history, the cash payment, the assignment to the East Wing's most isolated room, the fact that the admitting physician's log had a notation, brief, easily missed, formatted as a routine administrative entry that linked back to an order placed by a hospital administrator. Curtis Beale was still in the room when Meta found the notation. He was standing near the wall in the way of a man who has decided that stillness is equivalent to invisibility, which is a mistake that people in his position frequently make. Meta made a phone call. It was short. She stepped out of the room to make it. At 11 in the morning, 2 federal agents arrived at Rimrock Valley Medical Center. Curtis Beale left between them without handcuffs, which was somehow worse than handcuffs, a bureaucratic arrest, the kind that says the system has already decided and no longer needs to perform. He did not speak. He did not look at anyone as he moved through the lobby and out the glass doors into a winter morning that was, for the first time in days, utterly still. The hospital staff watched from windows. They did not know yet what they were watching. Caldwell's incident report was filed that afternoon. He described the overnight response as a coordinated team effort under challenging conditions and noted that the hospital's emergency protocols had performed as designed. Dina's name appeared once in the report, listed among 8 nursing staff members in a block credit. She read the report in her truck at the end of the shift. Engine running, the cracked passenger mirror catching a slice of winter light. The rim rocks were visible again now. The storm had stripped away everything soft, and they stood against a pale sky with the particular patience of geological time, holding their position above the valley without agenda or expectation. She folded the report. She placed it in the glove compartment, next to the registration, and an old receipt and a photograph she did not look at. She drove home. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Rimrock Valley Medical Center addressed to Dina Swiftwind, RN. CDC letterhead, signed by Dr. Constance Mater. It was a formal consulting offer, a position attached to a federal rapid response unit being assembled in direct response to the Billings incident. The compensation was significant. The work was exactly what she was built for. The letter sat on her kitchen table for 11 days without being moved. On the 12th day, Leona Runsfar came over for coffee. Leona was 81, a Crow elder who lived 3 houses down and had known Dina for 4 years without once asking her about anything that had happened before she arrived in Billings. This was not in curiosity. It was the specific respect of a woman who understood that some people build their present lives with great care and do not want that work disturbed. Leona sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and looked at the letter without touching it, the way a person looks at something they have already assessed and don't need to handle. Then she looked out the window. The rim rocks were visible from Dina's kitchen, darker than the sky behind them, still and certain. "Those rocks," Leona said, "have been watching this valley longer than anyone's been worth watching." "I know," Dina said. "They don't watch the loud ones," Leona said. She refilled her coffee with the unhurried authority of someone at home in any room they enter. "Never have. The loud ones come and go. The rocks watch the ones who stay, the ones who do what needs doing, and then go back to the work." The coffee was strong. Outside, a magpie landed briefly on the fence post and departed without explanation. "I haven't decided yet," Dina said. "I know," Leona said. Neither of them looked at the letter again. Whether it would be opened, whether she would take the position or set it aside in the glove compartment of a cracked mirror truck and return to the overnight shift and the supply closets and the charts that told only part of what she knew, that was a question the Rimrocks kept to themselves. They were patient. They had always been patient. They had watched this valley through ice and fire and everything in between, and they understood in the way that only very old, very still things understand that the most important decisions are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones made quietly in the hours before dawn when everyone else has stopped watching.